and welcome to the Leaderonomics Show. Today we have with us Charles Leadbeater. He is a leading authority on innovation and creativity. He's also a very successful author and also a consultant to leading companies from around the world. So thank you so much for being with us,
Pleasure.
Charles. I really enjoyed your session this morning. It was really fantastic. So I want to start with a thought that you brought up just earlier, and you said start where the mad is obvious, and that's what you need to do to be innovative. And you say the place to start is where conventional wisdom says that you are mad. And you bring up the idea, the example of Chester Carlson with his invention of the photocopier and how Kodak rejected it, and then he went on and subsequently started up Xerox. Now my question is, we live in a society where it's all about being accepted. It's about being part of the flock. It's about communal, it's a communal way of thinking. So how does a person be okay with being mad?
Here in Malaysia?
Yeah, especially here in the Asian context where culture is so, it's so communal. How do you be okay with being mad? And how do you, is that something that you're born with? Are people just naturally, are some people just naturally born with that ability?
Yeah, so I suppose my argument was that some people are naturally curious and they're led in that direction, but often it's circumstance that leads them there and they follow the logic of that. So if you look at what, for instance, Toyota did in car production, which at the time was mad because they created a system of production where you could change machines over, which was completely counter conventional wisdom. Why did Toyota do that? Well, it's because they were in such a crisis that they did it. So there are circumstances where people do these things because they've got no alternative, or because they're just very curious. So another Japanese innovation, the Walkman, was really the first time that anyone thought, what if people could listen to music on the go?
Yes.
So I think that in Asian cultures there are people who can think laterally and outside of those circumstances, but it does take a particular kind of curiosity, or perhaps being driven by constraints that make people do that.
Can that curiosity be taught, do you think?
I think it's, well, I think actually it can be ruined. Education often ruins curiosity. I mean, we drill children so hard that we stop them being curious. I think most children start life being incredibly curious and wanting to explore the world, and in a way education kind of narrows them down too much. So I think part of innovation is, I mean, sometimes part of innovation is about feeling playful. I mean, it's about kind of wanting to explore and not being too worried about that sort of conventional thinking that you referred to.
So I suppose when you're entering a company where you're encouraged to be innovative, and like you say, the education system may have taught you to get back in line. It's about creating that freedom and to say that once you step in these doors, you have the freedom.
Pixar, I think, is a very good example. Pixar, the animation company. I mean, obviously, they make films often for children or young audiences. A highly creative company, but so it's a special company. But they very deliberately want to try and create that sense of playfulness, of imagination, of possibility, of thinking big. And of course, in science, I mean, actually, a lot of science is about thinking big. It's about thinking kind of imaginative thoughts about the world. So somehow I think those companies need to sort of find a way back to that kind of sense of inspiration and possibility, I suppose, about the world.
And talking about possibility, you say that in certain environments, especially when there are constraints, innovative ideas suddenly become obvious. And like you mentioned about the ice cream cone. In 1904, when the man who ran out of tubs happened to be next to a waffle store, and so why not put the ball of ice cream onto a waffle? And so constraints were such that it became very obvious. Now in the context of companies, should we be creating constraints? Because sometimes so many things are given to us that we feel like everything's there.
No, you're right, there are constraints. So there are different sorts of constraints, but I think one of the things that will happen over the next decade and more is that constraints in terms of water, energy, climate and other things will drive people to more radical solutions. So I think, for instance, if you look at water, the future of water in cities, we need much more radical ways to recycle water or reuse it. So what's the leading place in the world, the leading city in the world for doing that? Probably Singapore. And Singapore which is heavily dependent on Malaysia for much of its water, actually recycles a lot of its water because it faced a real crisis in the 60s because it was running out of water. So I think if you can use constraints as a form of crisis to force companies to change and see the world in a different way, then it becomes creative. But often you're right that those constraints can feel conventional and you mustn't think outside them, and to do so will risk your career and so on and so forth. That reinforces doing what you've always done, maybe slightly differently.
At the very end of your session, somebody asked you about innovation versus imitation. And I wanted to just bring up something Bill Gates said in a March, just very recently actually, it's a March interview with TechCrunch. And here's what he said. He said, half the companies in the Silicon Valley are silly. They're creating, sort of instant messaging apps.
Right.
Yes, things that people in their 20s
Right.
are worrying about.
Right.
So that's what he means when he says that most of them are silly, but the dozen or so ideas that emerge out of that are going to be really important. So my question is does innovation come out of imitation? Do you need to have a lot of different, silly ideas for some good ones to come through?
Yes, I think that, there is a kind of high wastage rate. And I think that there is a dynamic relationship between imitation and innovation often. Because often what you find is that people emulate or adapt, and then by the process of adapting something, then they make a breakthrough. So there's a famous study of Dutch shipbuilding that followed how they adapted the hulls and the ships, and they took them to different places, and it was when they got into deeper waters in the sea that then they broke into a different technology. So this process of evolutionary change leading then to radical change is a kind of common process. So a very famous writer, Thomas Kuhn, wrote a book about scientific revolutions as that kind of process. So well, I think one of the things with innovation is that it comes in so many different ways that to say, oh no, you should only do that or you should definitely do that is probably wrong. It's about a sort of a whole mixture of things, and I think innovative people are invariably open and curious in all sorts of different ways about the world.
Fantastic. Let's talk about leading companies right now. I like what you said when you mentioned in order to lead a business, you need to be three things. You need to be a designer. You need to be an entrepreneur, and you also need to lead. You need to be a leader because there are people in your businesses. And a team also needs to be diverse in order to be innovative because there must be disagreement. And you mentioned the example in Hong Kong of, people of the same gender, similar kind of age, similar kind of background. You're not going to get much innovation there. My question is, what kind of diversity is needed for a team to be innovative?
The key thing about that diversity is that it needs to be diversity of ways that you think about the world. So you need diverse ways of thinking. So you might have quantitative skills and non-quantitative skills. You might have a designer and an accountant or an engineer. So you need, for the task, you need different ways of thinking. You probably need different backgrounds so that people have come from slightly different places. So they're not all coming from the same school or the same city or what have you. And you probably need sort of slightly different values about the world, about what really counts. And then when you get diversity but you bring people together, then you get new mixes, new recipes coming out of that. If everyone has the same intellectual background, they're all accountants and they're all the same age and they've all got the same sort of background, you'll get the same ideas.
But that's comfortable though, isn't it? And that's something you mentioned.
Exactly.
So as a leader, how do you lead a diverse team and get them to look beyond discomforts of being different?
So the first thing is that you need to make them in a way comfortable with that discomfort. So again, to go back to Pixar or to IDEO, the design company, they make this process of challenge and debate absolutely routine. Now, in a lot of companies, you only get challenged when something goes wrong, and it's a sign that something goes wrong. In those companies, no, it's just an everyday process of justifying your ideas, open debate, and so on and so forth. But the other thing is that you need to bind people with common objectives and values. So the really impressive organisations where you've got different people, different backgrounds, different skills, but same objectives.
Yes.
And then they start working together and coming together, and that's when you really see people take off. And of course you also see that in cities. Cities really take off when you get a sense of people coming together around a kind of, and sharing ideas, and that's what makes cities really creative. At the moment, London is a fantastic place for that to happen, but it's this sense of being able to bring different people to come together.
Now you mentioned something great as well called the law of attraction, and saying that that's what's needed to lead innovative teams. So I have a prop for you. Could you please explain to our audiences what you mean when you say law of attraction?
Well, it's when I was managing I had a senior job in a newspaper, and I had a responsible for a large number of people, but it felt to me, because I never had enough resources or enough time, that if I didn't move them, if I didn't push them, they wouldn't move. And so it felt like picking up a rock. So, if this felt like the organisation, the only way to get this to move would be to throw it, and you had to throw it with propulsion. Actually, what happens in really creative organisations is that you attract people to move because they're excited, they're inspired, they can see rewards, personal rewards, wider rewards, often not money, often recognition. And the laws of attraction to attract people to want to go in a certain direction because they think it's a good idea and they're excited by it, much, much more powerful than the laws of propulsion, which constantly require management to push. It's like the difference between push and pull. That if you're constantly having to push, you need someone who's constantly pushing. If you're pulling, it's more like a magnet. It's creating energy almost, not using it up.
Less exhausting too.
Less exhausting, but quite difficult to do because traditional management often, managers think they're in charge, they need to make decisions, they need to show that they're pushing people. If they don't push, nothing will happen. And actually this other kind of managing, which is managing through influence and leadership, is much more about setting people goals, allowing them to adapt, encouraging them to cooperate, articulating the goals, praising them, rewarding them, but creating the environment in which they want to do a good job. Most of the time, that's what people want to do.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We've been here with Charles Leadbeater. Thank you for joining us.